Hi everyone, welcome to Indian Polity Mastery. In this session, we are going to discuss about the types of ministers, the Council of Ministers. You're already aware about this term, the Council of Ministers, but what constitute this Council of Ministers? You may have certain doubts. Okay, so basically our executive, if you look at our executive, you can see that ministers are there because they are the ones who actually implement whatever policies we are actually framing in the parliament, whatever the legislations that we are actually making in the parliament. Who is executing that? Who is implementing that? So we have the ministers to implement these policies and these legislations. But ministers can be divided into different types. So the entire the ministry, we can actually call them as the Council of Ministers, but among the Council of Ministers itself you will be having different classifications. So let us try to understand that classification in this particular video. So the first one is regarding the cabinet ministers. As you might have heard about the cabinet ministers, so they are very supreme in nature because these head the important ministries of the central government. Okay, so the important portfolios, the important departments are actually handled by these cabinet ministers. So what are those important portfolios or ministries? One is home affairs, the defense, the finance, the external affairs, and so forth. So when you look at these portfolios, these ministries, you can see that they have that significance when it comes to the administration of a particular country. These ministries, the home ministry, the defense ministry, the finance ministry, the external affairs ministry, they all have their own role, their own significance in the administration. So whoever is actually handling these ministries, they will be a part of the cabinet ministers. So they are known as the cabinet ministers. So the entire council of ministers are not cabinet ministers, but cabinet ministers are actually part of the council of ministers. So cabinet is the chief policy making or policy formulating body of the central government. So if you look at the entire council of ministers, there are actually more than 60 to 70 ministers coming in the council of ministers. So whenever the government wants to take a particular decision, an urgent decision, okay, a decision which is having that emergency, so during that time they cannot call everyone and convene a session or a meeting and make a decision. So during that time what they will do is they will actually call only these cabinet ministers and they will take that decision. So that is why they are the chief policy formulating body of the central government. So what are the other types of ministers? The ministers of state. Okay, ministers of state, you might have heard about this term, and they are either be given independent charge of ministries. That means a minister who is actually taking care of the entire portfolio, entire ministry, that is actually known as the independent charge. Nobody is actually sharing that charge with anyone. And another one is they can be attached to certain departments or can be attached to certain cabinet ministers. So very important. So one thing, they can take care of the entire ministry, okay, the independent charge of an entire ministry, or they can take care of a particular department in that ministry, or they can be attached to a cabinet minister. So that is what is the ministers of state. So who is actually supreme here? The cabinet ministers are supreme. So when you look at the next level, you can see that the ministers of states are there. Then comes the deputy ministers. So who are these deputy ministers? They are attached to the cabinet ministers or the ministers of state and assist them in their administrative, political and parliamentary duties. Very important, okay, because the deputy ministers are assistants, or they are actually assisting or supporting the cabinet ministers or the ministers of state. Okay, I hope it is actually clear for you. The first level is actually cabinet ministers and the second level is the ministers of state. They may have an independent charge of a particular ministry, or they may be taking care of a particular department, okay, or they are assisted, or they are assisting a particular, or they are attached to a particular cabinet minister. But in the case of deputy ministers, they are supporting either the cabinet ministers or the ministers of state. Okay, hope it is clear. Now a classification regarding the council of ministers, the wider body, and the cabinet ministers. I have already told you that the cabinet ministers are actually part of this Council of Ministers. So what are the major classification, major differences you can actually find out? The first one, the Council of Ministers is a wider body. It may have around 60 to 70 ministers. Okay, so the total number, if you look at, you can see that they may have 60 to 70 ministers in a cabinet, in a Council of Ministers. And when it comes to cabinet ministers, it is a smaller body and it is having only 15 to 20 ministers. Okay, so because we already told you that it is actually the important portfolios, whoever is handling the important portfolios in a ministry, in a particular ministry, they will be made as the cabinet ministers. And the Council of Ministers includes cabinet ministers, ministers of state and deputy ministers. So whatever classifications we have made regarding the ministers, they are all part of the Council of Ministers. And when it comes to cabinet ministers, the only people who are actually having the charge of taking care of the cabinet, they will be coming inside this, that is the cabinet ministers only. So that is 15 to 20 minutes. The important portfolios will be handled by these ministers. And it has no collective functions. If you look at the Council of Ministers, they don't have any collective functions. But in the case of cabinet ministers, it has collective functions. So they are actually working as a group. But in the wider sense, you can see that the Council of Ministers are having that the collective functions or collective responsibility. Let us come to that later. And it is vested with all powers but in theory. So when it comes to the executive, whenever we use the term ministries, you know that the Council of Ministers is actually supreme. When we look at Article 74 of the Constitution, you can see that there shall be a Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister to aid and advise the President. So Council of Ministers is actually having that significance there, but in theory, who is actually taking the real decisions, the immediate decisions, they are actually taken by the cabinet ministers. Basically, they act on behalf of the Council of Ministers. And the Council of Ministers implements the decisions taken by the cabinet. So whatever decisions taken by the cabinet, it is actually implemented by the Council of Ministers. But on the other hand, the cabinet ministers directs the Council of Ministers. So whatever they need to do as a Council of Ministers, as a group, what they need to do, it will be directed by the cabinet ministers, because they are the supreme policy making body. Then it is constitutional body as per Article 74 and 75. So it is clearly mentioned in our constitution about the Council of Ministers. Article 74 and 75 of the Constitution clearly mentions about Council of Ministers. But the cabinet ministers were actually later added to the Constitution by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978. That means after the emergency, we are having a particular the amendment, that is 44th Constitutional Amendment in the year 1978, and they have inserted in Article 352. So in Article 352, there is the mention about the cabinet ministers. And the Council of Ministers are collectively responsible to the lower house. So they are collectively responsible. That means they are accountable to the lower house. Here the lower house is the Lok Sabha. They are accountable to the lower house. They are answerable to the lower house. It's very clearly, we need to understand that. And the cabinet ministers enforces the collective responsibility of the Council of Ministers. So who enforces that? It is the cabinet ministers who enforces the collective responsibility of the Council of Ministers to the lower house of the Parliament, that is the Lok Sabha. Okay, so these are the important information related to the ministers, okay, the Council of Ministers in our country, because they are actually implementing the policies, implementing the decisions taken by the Parliament. Very important to understand about it. And among these Council of Ministers also, cabinet ministers hold a supreme position. Okay, so we have something called as advanced membership. Okay, the original price of the advanced membership is 14,999, but in this December month, we are actually giving it on an offer price that is 2,999. And why we are actually giving that offer? Because as we all know, the Constituent Assembly was actually first met in the year 1946 in the month of December only. December 9th, we have actually had our first session of the Constituent Assembly. So what we offer in the advanced membership, the first one is the weekly webinar. Okay, every week you will be having a webinar, free webinar on current affairs, the static topics, and also how to prepare for the examination. And apart from all these, with more than 300 videos and notes, we are actually covering around 16 courses under this particular membership, and all are recorded videos or recorded sessions you will be getting. So with more than 300 videos are actually there. So one is how to prepare for civil service examination, the foundation that you need, and the second one is the overview of the Indian Constitution, then the history of Indian polity, very very important, the historical aspects we will be studying, the foundation for Indian polity will be studied, the union, state and citizenship as a particular course we will be studying, then the fundamental rights, the DPSP and fundamental duties, the president, governor and vice president, the prime minister, chief minister and the council of ministers, the parliament and the state legislature, the Indian judiciary, the local self-government, amendment, the constitutional and non-constitutional bodies. And apart from all these courses, the static, the conceptual courses, you are having two important other courses. One is based on the previous year's preliminary questions, and the second one is actually based on the mains question. So it is a comprehensive course. Okay, you will get all these courses with more than 300 videos inside that, with also with notes, okay, explaining the concepts. So grab this opportunity. This opportunity is only available in this month, in the month of December only. So grab this opportunity. I'll be there to give proper guidance for all of you in this journey towards success.